When we were looking into this Winfield massacre, what really stood out to me were those letters they found in Gilbert Twiggs' room
Yeah.
after the shooting. It's almost like they show a completely different side of him that I guess nobody expected.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know how sometimes those personal writings can just give you a little window into, the darker side of someone's thoughts, especially in a case as tragic as this.
It's like you look at the facts, and he seems like a pretty average guy, a miller, a veteran, but then you read what he actually wrote, all that anger and resentment towards the people in the town, and it just makes you wonder, who was this guy really?
It's like he had this whole hidden world of pain and bitterness bottled up inside him, and nobody around him had any clue.
Yeah, totally. So I think before we even get into what actually happened that night, we got to try and understand Winfield, Kansas back in 1903, the whole setting and what it was like. It was a pretty lively place back then, a real close-knit community, right?
Well, that's what we're seeing in all the historical stuff and those old newspaper clippings we dug up. Winfield was like booming, super active. Picture this: a warm summer night, August 13th. This military band led by, let me see, W.H. Kamen, I think. Yeah, W.H. Kamen. They're playing a free concert right there at Ninth and Main Street. And there's a huge crowd. I mean, huge, maybe 2,000, even 5,000 people. Everyone's having a good time. Music's playing. Kids are probably running all over the place. It's just a typical summer night, nothing out of the ordinary.
And then, right in the middle of all this, we have Gilbert A. Twigg, this 35-year-old miller, blending in with everyone else. What do we actually know about him, his life in Winfield before all this went down?
Well, it looks like he moved around a lot before ending up in Winfield. Lived in Montana, New Mexico, even other spots in Kansas. He was also an Army veteran, served in the Philippine-American War and the American occupation of Cuba.
Man, those were some brutal conflicts, completely different from the kind of battles they were used to before. Do we have any info on what he went through during those wars? Could that have messed him up, mentally?
It's definitely something to consider, yeah. Both the Philippine-American War and that Cuban occupation were all about guerrilla warfare. Lots of close combat, really brutal stuff. You can just imagine the kind of toll that kind of fighting would take on someone's mind.
Especially back then. I mean, they didn't even have PTSD or any real mental health help like we do today.
Exactly. Back then, they just called it shell shock or battle fatigue.
Yeah.
They didn't really understand how fighting in a war could mess you up for years and years.
So he might have been carrying all that baggage, all those inner demons, and nobody even knew how to help him. And get this, even with all that turmoil going on inside, he was mostly seen as harmless, agreeable, even a hard worker. But there's this one thing that just kind of sticks out. They called him Crazy Twig. What do you think about that?
It's kind of strange, right? I mean, it makes you think there was something about him. Maybe he acted a little odd or had mood swings and people noticed. But it seems like it was more of a nickname, not like people were seriously concerned about his mental state.
Yeah, it's more like, in those small towns, they give everyone a nickname, and his just happened to be Crazy Twig.
Hmm.
Didn't necessarily mean they thought he was dangerous or anything. But then, on that hot summer night, with everyone enjoying that concert, something inside Gilbert Twig just snapped.
He was hiding in this dark alley right behind the Oddfellows building. Had a 12-gauge double-barreled shotgun with him. And right when the concert was at its peak, music blaring, he aimed that gun and started firing into the crowd. Nobody saw it coming.
The newspaper accounts are insane. It was pure chaos. The music stopped. People were screaming, scrambling for cover. It went from this happy scene to a total nightmare in a second.
Yeah, it's crazy how fast things can change, right? One minute you've got families enjoying a concert, kids laughing, and then bam, you've got this outburst of violence, all that peace and innocence just gone.
6 people died right there. 3 more died later at the hospital, and something like 25 others were injured. It's hard to even fathom, especially because, mass shootings just weren't a thing back in 1903.
It's like a chilling foreshadowing of something that would become way too common in the next century.
So what happened to Twig after all that? Did he try to run?
Yep. After he did all that, 2 guys from the concert actually ran into that alley and tried to get the gun away from him. And that's when Twig shot himself. He used a revolver.
Tragic end to a horrible event. But him killing himself, it just leaves us with even more questions, Why would he take his own life after doing all that? Was it guilt? Or did he feel like that was the only way out? Or something else entirely?
It's really hard to say. Maybe he just felt like there was nowhere left to go, that he couldn't escape what he'd done. Or maybe it was a last act of control, going out on his own terms.
Or maybe, and we'll get into this when we talk about those letters, Maybe it was just pure despair, like he felt like he had absolutely nothing left to lose.
Yeah, it's tough, It's like you're trying to figure out how a storm happened by looking at what's left after it's gone. You can see the damage, but the why, like what really caused it, that's the tricky part.
Right. And with Twig, we do have those letters, and those might be able to give us some answers. One of them, it was meant for everyone, like a letter to the public. It's full of anger, blaming everyone in Winfield for something. He keeps saying they wronged him, ignored him, interfered with his life. He even talks about this girl who broke his heart, and that was like 10 years before all this happened.
And that public letter, it's so different from the one he wrote to his friend, the one in Montana. That one's more about how lonely he feels and how much he regrets not settling down and being happy like his friend.
It is weird. It's like those two letters are showing us totally different sides of this guy. One minute it's all rage and blame, and then the next it's all deep thoughts and sadness.
I guess maybe the public one was just his way of lashing out, trying to hurt the people he thought hurt him, right? But the one to his friend, that might have been the real him, the one dealing with all that loneliness and despair.
So it's almost like he was putting on a show in public, acting normal, when all this crazy stuff was going on inside.
Yeah, like wearing a mask or something. That's what we see a lot in these cases. Like the person seems totally normal, but underneath there's all this turmoil they're keeping hidden.
And then sometimes it just explodes in the worst way possible. That's what makes this Winfield thing so shocking, especially back then in 1903. Why was this such a huge deal? I mean, mass shootings were pretty much unheard of back then, weren't they?
It was like their whole sense of safety was shattered. Nobody back then could really imagine someone just shooting into a crowd full of people, just regular folks just enjoying themselves.
I mean, it's almost hard for us to get that now, right? I mean, sadly, it's become way too common.
Yeah, it was like this big wake-up call. It made everyone realize that something horrible could happen anywhere, anytime, even in a place that felt safe like their own town. It was a huge turning point, showing that bad things can happen even when people seem normal.
And that's a lesson that I guess we haven't really learned with all the mass shootings we see today.
It's true. It seems like it keeps happening over and over again. Someone who seems ordinary, but they're filled with anger or maybe have some mental health issues, and they just snap. And then so many innocent people get hurt. It's a terrible cycle.
So thinking about the Winfield massacre, what can we really learn from it? What does it tell us about all the gun violence we see today? What can we take away from this?
I think the biggest thing is we really got to understand mental health better. Back in 1903, it wasn't something people talked about, and it was seen as a bad thing if you had mental health problems.
So someone like Gilbert Twig, he might have just been suffering alone with nobody to help him.
Exactly. If you had mental health issues, people just labeled you as crazy and didn't try to understand what was really going on.
And even now, even though we know more about mental health, people still don't want to talk about it.
You're right. But the more we talk about it, the more normal it becomes, and maybe then we can stop things like this from happening again. We got to encourage people to get help, let them know it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah, it's about being aware of what people are going through and offering support, creating a system where people feel safe asking for help.
Exactly, because every time someone does something violent, there's a whole story behind it. A story of pain, of feeling alone and desperate. And maybe if we can understand those stories, we can actually change things for the better.
We know Gilbert Twig was really struggling, but what actually pushed him over the edge? I mean, is there anything in those letters that tells us about a specific person or thing in Winfield that might have set him off?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? The letters, they show us how angry and hurt he was, but they don't really say exactly what happened or who did what to make him do what he did.
So we're kind of left guessing. Was he really treated that badly by the people in town? Or was it all in his head, like maybe he just imagined things were worse than they were?
Maybe being in those wars, plus whatever other problems he had in his life, it could have messed up how he saw the world. Maybe he was seeing things that weren't really there, like he thought people were against him when they weren't.
That's something you see a lot with mass shootings today too, right? The shooter thinks they're the victim, like they have a good reason for doing what they did.
It's like they convince themselves it's okay, it's a really sad and dangerous thing, but that letter to his friend in Montana, it shows a different side of him. Like he wished he had a normal life, a family, and all that.
It's like he was torn between two different people. One minute he's blaming everyone else for being unhappy, and the next minute he's wishing he had what they have.
Yeah, like maybe underneath all that anger, he was just really sad, like he missed out on something important.
It makes you think, if he had found people he felt close to, a purpose in life, maybe things wouldn't have gone so wrong.
It's one of those questions we'll never know the answer to, I guess. But it does show how important it is to have friends and family, a community, especially if you're dealing with mental health stuff.
That's for sure. Having people around you can make a huge difference because feeling lonely and isolated, that can lead to some dark places.
It really shows that we gotta pay attention to the people around us. If someone seems down or like they're having a hard time, we should reach out. Sometimes just being nice, listening to them can really help.
So wrapping up our deep dive into the Winfield Massacre, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What can we learn from all this that might help us in our own lives?
I think the big thing is we need to understand each other better and have empathy. We may never really know why someone would do something like this, but we can try to create a world where people feel supported and get help if they need it. A world where mental health is important and people feel connected to each other.
Really well said. And maybe that's the most important thing we can learn from the Winfield Massacre. It's a reminder to learn from the past and try to create a better future. A future where something like this doesn't happen again. A future where everyone can enjoy a summer concert without being afraid.